So we're going to talk about William Carlos Williams today, and I want to start by saying something that maybe goes without saying, but um, I think that the COVID did very great things to America, great in a not good sense. It made us more distant from one another and more afraid of one another and less able to interact with one another. And um, I think one of the good things about COVID, it's hard to think about good things, it enabled people to go on Zoom and talk with one another about things that matter. I have colleagues, former colleagues at UVM, who hate endless meetings on Zoom, and some of you may be on endless meetings in Zoom, but Zoom allows people to get together who would not ordinarily get together. So I have a Zoom call once a month with my college roommates and a Zoom call twice a month with good friends from political days when I was in graduate school. And my oldest friend from high school and I get together and Skype or Zoom with each other. So I say this in a Zoom call, that what Zoom enables us to do is interact in ways we couldn't previously when everything was personal interaction. And I don't think we should somehow accept that personal interaction is less important. I think the sense of other human beings, seeing them, seeing their whole body language, seeing the space they occupy in the world, all of that is immensely important. Walt Whitman says in one of his best lines in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, I too was cast from the float, forever held in solution. It was precipitated out from the solution, which could mean the solution of all things in the universe, or it could mean the amniotic fluid. I too was precipitated from the float, forever held in solution. I too, I, I, I too knew myself by my body that I was. I knew I was of my body and what I should be. I knew I should be of my body. We all have bodies, and the bodies we have as they come in touch with others in a room, as we talk with one another, as we share the same air, I think it's really important. And Zoom doesn't, despite giving us images and sounds, doesn't do that. But it does other things and enables relationships that maybe we couldn't have otherwise. Okay, enough about Zoom. We'll go to William Carlos Williams. I'm going to start in a kind of professorial way by talking about some antecedents of William Carlos Williams. And oh my God, you can hold your head and say, what? We're going into Emerson? But we are. Here's Ralph Waldo Emerson. It was the fashion, it still is at UVM, at the beginning of the year to have an address to the new students. It was called the Phi Beta Kappa Address. And in 1837, Harvard graduate named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a preacher by that time, I kind of no longer a preacher, was invited to give the Phi Beta Kappa Address. And he gave an address which he published later as the American Scholar. All his essays were drawn from things he jotted in his notebooks, and he put them together, and maybe they hold together and maybe they don't. But this was, I think, I don't read enough, but I think it's the greatest literary document in American history. And it's because of the peroration, the part just before the end, where he says, he's kind of summing up. And he says, Mr. President and gentlemen, this confidence in the unsearched might of man belongs by all motives, by all prophecy, by all preparation to the American scholar. We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. Not so, brothers and friends. Please God, ours shall not be so. We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds. I cannot tell you how important that statement was. It was the clarion call that went out to American authors. They no longer had to imitate British or German writers. They no longer had to try and be continental in their attitudes. They could be Americans. And he continued in that. He said, you know, we'll walk on our own feet. I ask not for the great, the remote, the romantic, what is doing in Italy or Arabia, what is Greek art or Provençal minstrelsy. I embrace the common. I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar, the low. I want people not only to write about America, but to write about the things that occur in America. And then a passage I deeply love, he says, what would we really know the meaning of? The meal in the firkin. A firkin is a barrel, small barrel. The meal in the firkin, the milk in the pan, the ballad in the street, the news of the boat, the glance of the eye, the form and the gait of the body. So these are the things an American writer should write about, the small things of every day of life in America. And from that, I think there's a direct line to what William Carlos Williams was doing. But what Emerson didn't fully understand, he wrote essays and he gave grandiose speeches, was there's something else in America, which is an American language, the way we talk to one another. And to discover the American language, I think, would take near the end of the century, a Midwestern writer who wrote a novel in the voice of a 13-year-old boy named Huck Finn. I'm calling this the American vernacular. This is the opening paragraph of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of it, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That is nothing. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another. You know, you'll notice in those words a kind of a rhythm that is very different from the rhythm we had in Emerson just now, or much as I would like to stretch it, very different from the rhythm of Walt Whitman. This is the way people speak, full of ain'ts, and that ain't no matter, and stretchers for lies, and ungrammatical. The first sentence of the book is ungrammatical. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. So there's something in the American vernacular that captured the minds of American writers. Ernest Hemingway famously said, I think in The Torrents of Spring, all American literature descends from Huckleberry Finn. I think that's what he meant, that somehow Mark Twain understood it's not only the thing of writing about America and about American things, the meal in the firkin, the milk in the pan, but writing in an American language. So we come to William Carlos Williams, who's going to write about America in an American language. And I added this at the last minute. Wallace Stevens, who actually admired Williams a lot, wrote a book review of a book of his, and he said, you know, it's awfully anti-poetic. And it rankled Williams for years. And finally, he responded in a 1943 poem. He said, and they speak euphemistically of the anti-poetic, garbage, half the world ignored. I think what Williams is saying here is that if we cast out all the things that are anti-poetic, that are not fit subjects for poetry, that are too small or dirty or unimportant for poems, half the world is ignored. And poets write about only half the world. So let's take a look at William Carlos Williams. He went to medical school and became a doctor, as you can see from this card. He was a doctor, and he had a chance to be a doctor on Park Avenue, make a fortune. And he instead decided to go to Rutherford, New Jersey, where he'd grown up, and be a family doctor, a general practitioner. And he practiced among working class New Jersey people. And then there came what we know now as the Great Migration, when Black people moved up from the South, and his clientele, the patients he served were mostly Black. And then there was another migration from Puerto Rico, and the people he doctored to were mostly Puerto Rican. So he stayed in place, and he was, without big calling out, oh, I'm great, I treat the working class. He was a doctor to the working class. There's a picture of Williams as a young man. Here's a picture of him as an older man. And here, and this is important, here's a picture of him in his office. And you'll notice he's sitting at his typewriter. His typewriter was on a desk that folded down into the knee hole. It was called a knee hole desk. And when patients came in, the typewriter was down and he could write them prescriptions on the desk and he could talk to them. But between patients, he could hammer on the keys and write poems. And that's why I think most of his poems are short. He wrote them between patients. There's another picture of Williams with this typewriter. And there he is, an elderly man. He had a stroke when he got older in his 60s and had to give up medicine. And his poems got longer, and we'll deal with some of those longer poems later. This is maybe my favorite of his poems. 4 stanzas, 3 stanzas, 4 lines each, no rhymes, no set meter. We're in the realm of free verse here. I've eaten the plums that were, this is just to say, is the title. I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox in which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. What I first loved about the poem was that they captured in very few words the deliciousness of the world in which we live. And it's a big statement. The plums were delicious, so sweet, and they come from the icebox, right? The refrigerator, and so cold. So there's something in this poem about the love of the pleasures of the body and of living in a world of physical things. And I think that's enough to carry the poem, but there's much more to the poem. There is the vexing problem, and it is a vexing problem of just what is the relation of the title to the poem. The title goes, this is just to say, I've eaten the plums over in the icebox. And Corey asked me before about the poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, which begins actually, it's called The Red Wheelbarrow, appeared in 1921, and it appears, so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So there he puts in the poem, so much depends upon. Here, that so much depends on is at the beginning. I have to say this to you. This is just to say. Well, I don't have to say it. I sort of want to say it. So the problematic relation between the title and the poem, whether the title is part of the poem or not, is, I think, before us. And I don't think it's soluble. It's just an interesting question. There's no word in this poem save icebox, which any kid of the 1930s would have understood, because before refrigerators, there were boxes people had which you put ice in to keep things cold. There's no word in this poem that it wouldn't be accessible to a 5-year-old kid. I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. And one of the things that I think occurs to us as when we read it is this is very much like a note, other than this is just to say that he might have taped up to his refrigerator, right? I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox in which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So the question becomes, as we address this poem, as we look at this poem, is there a distinction between the things of the world, the unpoetic, and poems? Is there a distinction between what we revere in poems and the stuff of everyday life? And he was preceded in this by a very, 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 very famous painter and sculptor who maybe is not given adequate notice. I mean, he's quite well known, but our great geniuses are Picasso and Matisse. But here's a third of the triumvirate, Marcel Duchamp. In 1913, he took a bicycle wheel, drilled a hole in a stool, stuck the bicycle wheel in the hole, and put it in a art show. Took something from the world, put two things that are not usually regarded together, and created the sculpture. And so you see from these dates, it was originally done in 1913, but hey, it's a bicycle wheel and a stool. You can buy a bicycle wheel and a stool and do it yourself. And so this replica, this model, is as good as the original, according to Duchamp. This is from 1914. It's called Bottle Rack. He went into a hardware store and got a rack that the French, being frugal, they drink their wine and wash out the bottles and put them upside down on these things here, and they dry out. And he just put it, I'd say, in a museum. It may have been an art show. Something could be taken, and he called these ready-mades from the world, ready-made, and put into an artistic environment and treated as an art event. This is called In Advance of the Broken Arm. Cute title. It's a snow shovel he bought in a hardware store and put in a museum or a show. And here is his most famous of those things. This is called Fountain. He got himself a urinal, placed it on its side. Normally this would be the bottom here, this thing here. And he signed it. Of course, he signed it spuriously with the naval R Mutt. You are a mutt, right? And he dated it. And the idea of the ready-made, the idea that the artist doesn't have to be someone with a brush doing something that's extraordinary, but can also be someone who sees something in the world and says, hey, look at this too, is, I think, very much a Duchampian notion. And I think it very much helps us understand what's going on. And it's I mean, it's a very short poem in very simple words, but it challenges many notions of art about what a poem is, about the relation of a title to the poem, of the language of poems. Wordsworth famously said, a poem must be in the language truly spoken by men. Well, he tried, but he didn't do it. But this is the language truly spoken by men and women. I ate those plums. They were pretty good. Now, I'm going to segue into something I learned about 25 years ago called speech act theory, which is a philosophical adventure, sort of. A man named J.R. Austin said, well, you know, words are supposed to make up meaningful statements, but what if words actually do things in the world? The title of his book was called How to Do Things with Words. When you christen a boat, the Queen Elizabeth, for example, you take a bottle of champagne and you batter it on the hull till it cracks, and you say, I christen you Queen Elizabeth. And the word is not describing anything, it's doing something. It is the act of doing something. And Austin began to realize that perhaps speech acts subsumed all the other uses of speech in the world. Now I want you to focus on these last 4 lines. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. This is what's known as an infelicitous speech act. He doesn't really want to be forgiven. How do I know that? Because he said they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So he's both apologizing and not apologizing at one and the same time. He's saying something that he doesn't really mean. And if one steps back from this poem, it is the reenactment of the scene in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve eat the apple and they say, it's good. And God say, what have you done? And so in this poem, this person is tasted of the fruit that was forbidden. You were probably saving it for breakfast and eaten of it and said it was good, and then asked afterwards to be forgiven. It's a lot of freight to carry for a 12-line poem of simple words. And it's a lovely, lovely poem. Here's another short poem, and I think you'll recognize by now that he not only writes short poems, but that they challenge us in great ways. Again, it's a poem. There are no words in here that a 5-year-old in 30s would not have known. Cinders are the clunkers left after coal, which was used for heat. Are after the coal is burned up, the clinkers are gathered up and thrown away. And you'll notice this poem is about what William's contemporary T.S. Eliot, who he really disliked, and I've inherited his dislike, would have called a wasteland, right? It's the back, not the front, and nothing will grow there, right? So the back wings, nothing will grow, and it's a heap of cinders, and among those cinders is a broken Ballantine ale bottle or something like that. I mean, this is a junk pit with thrown out clinkers and in the back where nobody cares about, and there's this broken bottle, and yet the word that transformed this poem is the word shine. Between walls, the back wings of the hospital where nothing will grow, lie cinders in which shine the broken pieces of a green bottle. And it's that ability to find shining in the midst of the, if I can use that word he used before, the unpoetic, the ability to find something of redemptive value and of beauty and of excitement in the midst of what we all would ignore, that marks Williams as a poet. I want you to recognize how astonishing this poem is. 90% of us, probably greater, but I'm being kind to those who are better viewers than me, would look at this scene and say, "Ugh, junk." You know, we go from the back of the hospital to the front of the hospital and look at the green lawn. Or not for Williams. Anything worth looking at is worth seeing, because if we look closely, we see what is really there and not what we think it is. That is a junky backyard. Here's another Plum poem. He's the great Plum poet. He only has 2 Plum poems. This is another poem I love. To a Poor Old Woman. And let me stop before we read the poem. She's poor, means she doesn't have much, and she's old, which means that her youth has gone and she's in the long decline towards dying. And it runs this way. To a poor old woman, and I think in this poem we have to read the title as part of the first stanza, because all the stanzas have 4 lines. To a poor old woman munching a plum on the street, a paper bag of them in her hand. So she's eating a plum and she's carrying plums home from the store, and she can't wait till she gets home before she eats this plum. To a poor old woman munching a plum on the street, a paper bag of them in her hand, they taste good to her. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. I'll come back to that later, but a modern word would be he deconstructs that phrase. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. You can see it by the way she gives herself to the one half sucked out in her hand. I mean, it's a gorgeous poem. I mean, he's looking at this woman and she gives herself to the plum. Half of it is already sucked out. So delicious, so sweet, and so cold. You can see it by the way she gives herself to the one half sucked out in her hand. Comforted, a solace of ripe plums seeming to fill the air. They taste good to her. Those lines here are just brilliant beyond compare. She's poor and she's old, and we would all pass her by and think, well, you know, bag lady or something. I don't. Some of us might not, but most of us wouldn't. And he sees that she's comforted by this plum, by the delights of the flesh which is enduring, that she finds solace, she finds a comfort, and the word solace means comfort, right? She's got this. These plums make her comforted, and that's why they taste good to her. And then we'll go back, if I can, to this previous page, notice how he rolls around the phrase. It's going to repeat itself 4 times in the poem. They taste good to her. Here is the last line of the poem. They taste good to her is the second time. They taste good to her. And it is in this poem, he's rolling around in his mouth. They taste good to her in the same way she is rolling around in her mouth the taste of the plums. There is a kind of confluence of the speaker of the poem or the writer of the poem and the object that he's looking at, the subject of the poem, which is the old woman eating plums. And just as she gives herself over to the taste of the plums, to the one half sucked out in her hand, so he gives himself over to the words, they taste good to her. And just as she is comforted, so he, in seeing, remember, I can't emphasize this enough. She's a poor old woman. And yet she has this moment, just as we saw a shining of a bottle in a wasteland of cinders, so we see here in this poor old woman, someone who is comforted and finds solace in the pleasures of plums. I'm going to shift a little bit here to a friend of Williams. He went to his gallery a lot. Alfred Stieglitz was a photographer, and he founded a gallery called 291, which was in New York City. And Williams, who lived in Rutherford, New Jersey, often went there. There's a self-portrait of Stieglitz, and there is a gallery in 1915. You can see how avant-garde it was. It had an exhibition of Picasso and Braque, who are not yet famous. Here's a photograph by Stieglitz. I think his way of looking at the world affects how Williams looks at the world. This is a snowstorm in New York, and instead of, I don't know, showing the pristine snow over everything, you've all seen the ads on television. Here's a horse-drawn cab or omnibus slogging its way through the slush, and here's some on the side, some shovels perhaps, and this is not an idyllic scene. This is the scene as it was. Here's one of his famous photographs, the terminal, the moment at which the horses which draw the omnibuses are resting as they turn around at the terminal, and they're sweating into the cold air. He's seeing what's right in front of him. And now we get to what I think are more important photographs for Williams. This is a really stunning photograph. He's looking at Fifth Avenue. You can notice here, I don't know if you can see it in your thing, the horses here and the cab or the carriage is drawn is cut off. Who cares about what's cut off? And we see the backs of other cabs and the back of men. And what really dominates the picture is this great, almost vertical line of the tree in the foreground. And here's another tree in the foreground. This is called Flatiron Building. The Flatiron Building was an architectural marvel. It was kind of a pyramid in shape, like a flattened pyramid. And he's more interested in the tree in front of it than he is in the building. And we're going to see that again and again in Williams, who sees the bright green glowing of the bottle, who sees the woman giving herself over to the plum half chomped out in her hand. This is his most famous photograph. I don't know what to make of this. It's called Steerage. It's about people who are arriving in New York on the Lower East Side. I'm very fond of this snapshot of Paris. I mean, he just took it, and somehow this woman appears. It's not like he's focused on her. She just appears in it, just this woman here, just as somebody appears here. It's just things as they are revealed in front of him without a lot of the photographer trying to frame things to get exactly what he wants. This is called Proletarian Portrait. Most of you know what a proletarian is. It's a working class person, and that's given away in the first 3 lines. She's big, not svelte. Young, well, it doesn't mean proletarian. She's bareheaded, she's not wearing a bonnet. She's wearing an apron, kind of sign of her working class status. She's just come out of a kitchen, perhaps. Her hair is slicked back. Well, we know what that means, slicked back hair. I mean, I suppose some people at the Tony Awards had slick back hair, but they used gallons of mousse. I mean, just to slick back your hair is a sign of being a working class and not understanding that hair needs to be teased and shaped and styled. So she's revealed in many ways as being this working class woman. Again, like the poor old woman, somebody we might not pay attention to if we weren't Williams. A big, young, bareheaded woman in an apron, her hair slicked back, standing on the street, one stocking foot toeing the sidewalk, her shoe in her hand. And when I would teach this course in a class, I would take off my shoe, and he says, "You're one stocking foot toeing the sidewalk." She didn't want her whole foot to get dirty, so she's looking to her shoe, and I take off my shoe and I toe the floor of the classroom. But you can all imagine this. Looking intently into it, she pulls out the paper insole, and again, an indicator of poverty, right? She can't afford the insole that came with the shoe. She can't afford leather insoles. She papers over the bottom of the shoe literally papers it over with paper, maybe a piece of newspaper, to keep the sole from wearing out. She pulls out the paper insole to find the nail that has been hurting her. So he is attentively watching this woman. I really love that. One stocking foot toeing the sidewalk. And as he looks intensely at her, she looks intensely into the shoe. She's focused on the nail that has been hurting her. He's focused on the woman who has captured his sight as he looks out on the street or walks down the street. So this is a poem about not only a woman, but about poetry, about keenly observing, carefully, and with great attentiveness, what is in front of one. Again, I would suggest to you that this is very unpoetic in its subject, a proletarian portrait, this let's go back. A big, young, bareheaded woman in an apron, her hair slicked back. I mean, who would write about that? Well, Williams would, and he'd find a moment of great attentiveness, and I think of great beauty, because she's toeing that sidewalk in the same way, perhaps, that Degas had ballerinas toeing the ground in his portraits. There's something delicate and poised in her. Here's again a picture of a bush in the foreground. We'll come back to this later when we get to the poem Hunters in the Snow. This is a poem it's very much a city poem, you could call it, and it's a poem of the sun in the city and how one sees it in fall as the light is fading. There's a plume of, and it's really a study of a chimney and the metal strappings on it and a bit of the light reflecting off those trappings, and that's it. There's a plume of flesh pale smoke upon the blue sky. The silver rings that strap the yellow brick stack at wide intervals shine in this amber light, not of the sun, not of the pale sun, but his worn brother, the declining season. So he sees not so much the sunlight as the autumn light reflected in these bands on the chimney. And again, we have an urban scene, and one that, I don't know, maybe photographers would take a picture of, but poets don't write about chimneys with silver bands on them. but he does, and he finds in them something of, I think, of revelation of this is what is there, and here I can see what it looks like to be in the declining season. Stiglitz was married to, I'm not sure happily, I think they divorced, the famous artist George O'Keeffe. And I wanted to show you this photograph, Apples and Gable, 1921. Stiglitz and his wife summered close to here in Lake George, New York. And I think what you'll notice, and you can see this already, Williams is very interested in placement. So much depends on the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. It's the placement. And here's the placement of a sprig of apples in front of a gabled house. And I think this too is a portrait of something in front of something else. I think there's more political content here than I at first want to admit. There's a live woman whose feet are like columns in front of a bank, whose columns are mechanical and speak of solidity of your investments. But it's this juxtaposition of something in front of something else, and his focusing on what we should focus on, which is the young woman with her dress in front of the bank, and not the bank itself, which is what will appear in the insurance company calendars that we all get in the mail around Christmas now. The bank is a matter of columns, like convention, unlike invention, but the pediments sit there in the sun to convince the doubting of investments solid as a rock upon which the world stands, the world of finance, the only world, just there talking with another woman while rocking a baby carriage back and forth, stands a woman in a pink cotton dress, bare-legged and headed, whose legs are two columns to hold up her face like Lenin's, her loosely arranged hair profusely blonde, or Darwin's, and there you have it, a woman in front of a bank. As I said, one can see political content in this poem, and I'm not denying it. I think it's there. This live woman with legs like columns in the bank, which is supposed to reassure us of its solidity. But I think what's so surprising in this poem, and I love this poem also, is its juxtaposition of one thing in front of another. And his attention is on the thing we're not supposed to pay attention to, a woman with a baby carriage in a pink cotton dress and with loose hair, a woman in front of a bank. It's a famous photograph of Stiglitz called Spring Showers, 1902. And I think Williams may have had this in mind when he wrote this next poem, although he might not have. In any case, it's very similar to this poem. You notice it's a rainy street, and there's rain in the street, and here's a tree that goes halfway up before it splits. And it's sycamore trees, which is, the poem is called Young Sycamore, have, when they mature, have balls. They're actually round balls of tightly packed seeds. So they're called balls. And I think that's what he refers to halfway through the poem. I must tell you, this young tree, whose round and firm trunk between the wet pavement and the gutter where the water is trickling rises bodily into the air with one undulant thrust half its height. And I'm going to go back to, you can see how it goes up half its height. Dividing and waning, sending out young branches on all sides, hung with cocoons, it thins till nothing is left of it but two eccentric, knotted twigs bending forward, horn-like at the top. So what has happened in this poem, if we can look at it, is that his eye has gone from the ground, literal ground, and the wetness of the ground, from the pavement and gutter, and it's gone up the trunk with one undulant thrust half its height. And then it divides and wanes and sends out young branches on all sides. Eyesight has gone from the bottom up to the branches dividing until it reaches the top, hung with cocoons. Those are the balls on the sycamore tree. It thins till nothing is left of it but two eccentric knotted twigs bending forward, horn-like at the top. So we have followed his vision in this poem. Unlike other poems, which he has a kind of like a snapshot, we followed his vision from the beginning to the end, from start to finish. This is, I think, the greatest of all his poems. He wrote a book, I think about 1917, called Spring and All. And in it, he has experiments, poems, prose pieces, drawings. And one of the poems in it, which is called Spring and All, sometimes is actually better called by his first line, By the Road to the Contagious Hospital. No more wondrous poem has ever been written in America. Again, we're not dealing with terribly poetic language here. In fact, we're looking at, he's driving from the hospital by the road to the contagious hospital. And the sky above him is blue with clouds in it, under the surge of blue mottled clouds driven from northeast to cold wind. And what he sees is a wasteland, literally a wasteland, like Eliot would write about in his famous poem of 1922. Beyond the waste of broad, muddy fields, brown with dried weeds, standing in fallen patches of standing water, the scattering of tall trees. I mean, everything is a wasteland there. It's a lot of trees and stuff out there. And he's going to use the word stuff. One of my favorite lines in 20th century poetry is this one. All along the road, the reddish, purplish, forked, upstanding, twiggy stuff remains stuff, even though he has defined it with an extraordinary run of 5 adjectives: reddish, purplish, forked, upstanding, twiggy stuff of bushes and small trees with dead brown leaves under them, leafless vines. So you know what he's seeing. He's driving by the road to the contagious hospital, and he's seeing a field in springtime with everything dead, right? Dried weeds and dead brown leaves and leafless vines and cold, muddy fields, cold wind, muddy fields. Everything is that time of year we in Vermont called mud season, which nobody loves. And notice what happens. The poem turns on this line. Leafless vines, lifeless in appearance. Leafless, lifeless. Only appears that way because spring is coming. Sluggish, dazed, spring approaches. So spring is approaching, and it's approaching slowly and without much sense of what it is. It's sluggish, it's dazed. And then we come to this strange pronoun, they enter the new world naked. And I would suggest that there are two, and I'll add a third at the end. There are two ways to read the they. The they is the plants which are about to get reborn in the spring. And it's also the hospital, which, remember from the first line, is contagious. It's contagious with the birth of young beings, of infants, right? They enter the new world naked, that's young babies, cold, uncertain of all, save that they enter, all about them the cold, familiar wind. And now he switches from the babies to what he sees here. Now the grass, tomorrow the stiff curl of wild carrot leaf, one by one, objects are defined. It quickens, clarity, outline of leaf, but now the stark dignity of entrance, still the profound change has come upon them. Rooted, they grip down and begin to awaken. So the awakening is of the children in the hospital who are the infants who are just born naked and cold, but objects are defined for them, and they begin to enter a world which will be their world. And in the same way, things grow in the spring. I will Be a little anecdotal here. I used to teach this poem sometimes around this time of the year to students at the University of Vermont. And I'd say, spring is coming. And my students would kind of go, oh? I'd say, look at the buds on the trees. They're getting larger, which they are. And look at the grass. If you scrape, when there's no snow, if you scrape down the grass and beneath the grass and beneath all the dead grass, you'll find little bits of green that is about to come up. I mean, this poem taught me to observe the world closely because there are things going on in it, an awakening, a quickening, a birth that we don't see because we see a muddy field, and yet it is becoming alive and about to green up and become full and fertile and rich, just as babies are born with nothing and take things in, and things are defined for them, and it quickens clarity, outline of leaf, but now the stark dignity of entrance. Still the profound changes come upon them. This is the babies as well as the plants rooted. They grip down and begin to awaken. There are two awakenings here going on. One is of the plants and one is of the babies born into the hospital. I think there's a third awakening, and that is the imagination of the poet who is riding along the road and sees, as he looks carefully, that yes, if I grip down and begin to awaken, I too can see everything that is going on, that I too can enter the new world naked, like Adam in the Bible, and have the stark dignity of entrance. It's quite a remarkable poem. The poet biographer Paul Mariani took New World Naked as the title of his biography of Williams. Here's another poem. I like this poem very much. It's a poem about a hurricane. And what's happened is he and his mother have gone north of Rutherford, where he lived. They've gone to the country, and the hurricanes come, so they get in the car and go home because the hurricane's coming. And they have to get off the parkway because it's flooded and take back roads. And that's what the poem is about. It's called The Forgotten City. When with my mother I was coming down from the country the day of the hurricane, trees were across the road and small branches kept rattling on the roof of the car. There was 10 feet or more of water, making the parkways impassable, with wind bringing more rain in sheets. Brown torrents gushed up through new sluices in the valley floor, so that I had to take what I could find bearing to the south and west to get back to the city. So the rain has come down, and the parkways are impassable, as you see here. And everywhere water seems to be flowing and flooding. And so I just went by dead reckoning south and west, going back home. That's the setting of the poem. I passed through extraordinary places, as vivid as any I ever saw, where the storm had broken the barrier and let through a strange commonplace. I would pause there. The commonplace has become strange here, what one sees every day, because the hurricane and the water and the wind and the broken branches, everything looks different. Long deserted avenues are formerly choked with people in cars, with unrecognized names at the corners and drunken-looking people, like they're fighting against the wind, and drunken-looking people with completely foreign manners, monuments, institutions, and in one place a large body of water startled me with an acre more of hot jet sprouting up symmetrically over it. And then one of the great one-line sentences in 20th century poetry, parts. I had no idea where I was and promised myself I would someday go back to study this curious and industrial people who lived in these apartments at these sharp corners and turns of intersecting avenues with so little apparent communication with an outside world. Let me stop there. What's happened is he's had an extreme estrangement. And the world he lives in, which is in this case northern New Jersey, because of the hurricane, because of the water, because there are not many people on the streets, and those that are on the streets are hunched against the hurricane, everything looks strange to him. So the familiar has become strange, and he sees it with a kind of a freshness and a newness, and that's exciting to him. And then he says, in what is, I think, a very political statement, how did they, the people who live in northern New Jersey, how did they get cut off this way from representation in our newspapers and other means of publicity when so near the metropolis, so closely surrounded by the familiar and the famous? How do we become so accustomed to the things around us that we no longer can see who they are, and they no longer get represented in our works of news and literature? You remember Whitman said in lines I gave you out of context, the wonder is always and always how there can be a mean man or an infidel. How can it be that such marvelous people in such marvelous places are amongst us, and we don't see any picture of them in our poems, in our movies, in our newspapers? A bastard piece, you want to read this word piece as P-E-A-C-E also, because of what comes up at the end. And what he's seeing is, it's a very visual scene. He's looking at a river, and he's cut off from the river by cyclone fence. And beyond the fence is, I think, what is a sewage disposal plant and covers of sewers. And for the life of me, I could not figure this as the subject of a poem. And yet it is for him the subject of a poem, and a poem in which he finds peace, and a poem in which he finds one of the great words in 20th century poetry. And nobody else could have written this. This young boy is got a pretend wagon, and he says to the horse, "Get up!" Right? And we all do that as children, right? Giddy up, giddy up. And so and yet he finds peace in this. It'll turn out to be cracked houses and a couple of white chickens. It's an impoverished place. And yet the peace here is the peace of this is the world which we live in. Bastard Peace. Let me just go up. I wrote the title wrongly. It's peace this way. Where a heavy woven wire fence topped with jagged ends encloses a long cinder field by the river. Again, we have this area covered with cinders, and it's beyond the fence, and the river is beyond it. This is not your normal, lovely river view. A concrete disposal tank at one end, small wooden pit covers scattered about above sewer intakes, most probably. Down the center is a service path graced on one side by a dandelion in bloom and a white butterfly. The sun parches still the parched grass. Along the fence, blocked from the water, leads the washed out street. 3 cracked houses, a willow, 2 chickens, a small boy with a homemade push cart walking by, waving a whip. Get up! No other traffic or like to be. There to rest, to improvise and unbend. Through the fence, beyond the field, in shining water, 12 o'clock blows. You know, those are the horns that used to come at noon to let people know that 12 was there before everybody had iPhones and watches on the wrist. 12 o'clock blows, but nobody goes other than the kids from school. So his imagination, he tells us in this poem, comes to rest in this urban, semi-urban environment that most people would ignore, with cinders and cyclone fences, excuse me, 3 cracked houses, a willow, 2 chickens, a small boy with a homemade pushcart. I mean, this is where he lives, in the America that is not the America that our celluloid dreams would have us live in. This is a longer poem, and it asks us to go from present to past, back to present, if you can deal with that complexity. What's going on here is he has Christmas greens, hemlock and spruce branches along the fireplace and on top of the fireplace. And he remembers when he went to the forest to cut them. That's going back. He'll go back to when they cut the greens. And he'll remember how the snow was flying and the greens were a shelter from the storm for the birds there. And then he'll come back to the present. Christmas is past and the greens are past due and they need to be burnt. And so he shoves them in the fireplace on top of a smoldering log, and all of a sudden they burn up and disappear. And it's a poem of, I think, a transformation of one world transforming into another. And he just is marveling and refreshed, as he says, by the transformation, the violent, recreant transformation. Burning the Christmas greens. Their time past, pulled down, cracked, and flung to the fire, go up in a roar. The go up in a roar is the greens. Go up in a roar, all recognition lost, burned clean in the flame, the green dispersed, a living red, flame red, red as blood wakes on the ash and ebbs to a steady burning. The rekindled bed become a landscape of flame. So he's looking at the fire in the fireplace. And now we go back. I told you there's a one which goes from the present to the past. At the winter's midnight, we went to the trees, the coarse holly, the balsam and the hemlock for the green. At the thick of the dark, the moment of the coal's deepest plunge, we brought branches cut from the green trees to fill our need. And over doorways about paper Christmas bells covered with tinfoil and fastened by red ribbons, we stuck the green prongs. In the windows hung woven wreaths, and above pictures a living green. So they cut the greens in the woods and they hung them around the house. On the mantle, we built a green forest, and among those hemlock sprays put a herd of small white deer as if they were walking there. All this, and it seemed gentle and good to us. The greens in the house for Christmas. Their time past, relief, the room bare. We stuffed the dead grate with them upon the half burnt out logs, smoldering high, opening red and closing under them, and we stood there looking down. Green is a solace. We had that word before in the plum poem. Comfort is a solace, a bright plum seeming to fill the air. Green is a solace, a promise of peace, a fort against the cold, though we did not say so, a challenge above the snow's hard shell. Green, we might have said, that where small birds hide and dodge and live their plaintive rallying cries blocks for them and knocks down the unseen bullets of the storm. So he's thinking back again to the green boughs that he cut and how they were protection, right? A challenge above the snow's hard shell where small birds hide. Green spruce boughs pulled down by a weight of snow. And here's the key word in the poem, I think, transformed. Violence, because all of a sudden these green branches on top of the smoldering red eye of the log burst into flame. Violence leaped and appeared, recreant, roared to life as the flame rose through and our eyes recoiled from it, so bright and hot. In the jagged flames, green to red, instant and alive, green, those sure abutments, the green of the forest, gone, lost to mind, and quick in the contracting tunnel of the great appeared a world, black mountains, black and red, as yet uncolored and ash white, an infant landscape of shimmering ash and flame, and we, in that instant, lost, breathless to be witnesses, as if we stood ourselves refreshed among the shining fauna of that fire. So what we have in this poem is the transformation, even though it is violent, right? We have violence transformed and violence transformed at the bottom here, and violence here. And it's shockingly bright for a moment as these dead branches, dried out branches, which were green, suddenly turn red, and then black and red, and then ash white. And this ending, which is so unbelievably lovely, he looks at the world that is in transformation, and he's staring into this fireplace, and he says, an infant landscape of shimmering ash and flame, and we, in that instant, lost, breathless to be witnesses, as if we stood ourselves refreshed among the shining fauna of that fire. So we have become the sheep that were on the mantle, and we've become refreshed, breathless to be witnesses. I find it just stunningly beautiful, and the language is so unpoetic in the sense that we're not dealing with fancy language here. Stevens could muster that, and Keats and Shakespeare, but an ash white and infant landscape of shimmering ash and flame, and we in that instant lost, breathless to be witnesses, as if we stood ourselves refreshed among the shining fauna of that fire. I mentioned to you that Williams had a stroke, and he wasn't a doctor anymore, and he didn't write as many poems, and he tended to be longer all along. He had been writing short stories and essays, and some longer poems, but he wrote a very long poem called Patterson, an epic, which I have read many times, and I think is not so great. It has some great moments, but I think he lost his way in Patterson, trying to make an American epic out of an American scene. It's set in the Falls of Patterson, the site of the first industrial revolution in America, and the park that exists today in Patterson, New Jersey. But after he had the stroke, he looked at paintings, and he wrote these pictures from Bruegel, and he wrote a long love poem to his wife called Asphodel, that greeny flower. I'll finish with a few lines from that, which I think it's problematic, but I think it's the greatest love poem in English, and along with Anna Akhmatova, he's the master of the long poem in the 20th century because of that poem. So this is a series of poems called Pictures from Bruegel, and he took Bruegel long ago. Peter Bruegel was an artist of the what we now call he was a Flemish artist, and it's next to Holland. It's Belgium, but Belgium is half Holland, half Flemish. I don't know. And he found in Bruegel's dual allegiances. This is in 1500s. And his dual allegiances to ordinary people and everything one could see in them, and a great carefulness of vision. Art historians usually distinguish between the Florentine and the Northern School. Those in Florence, the great painters of Italy, painted the spirit of human beings, and the painters of the North painted the facticity, the factual actualities of human existence. And Bruegel painted the actualities of human existence, but of ordinary people, not of nobles. This is the least good of those pictures from Bruegel, but I have it, so we'll do it. And here's the picture. It's called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. And here's a guy plowing, and here's a kind of dull shepherd looking up at the sky, and here are the sheep that the shepherd is doing. There's a city on the horizon, and there's a ship that's going by, and there's Icarus who fell from the sky. Icarus was the son of Daedalus. Daedalus was the great craftsman, and he made wings for Icarus, and he said, "Here, I made you these wings, and they are made of feathers stuck in wax, and you can do anything you want, Icarus, except don't fly too close to the sun, because the wax will melt and the feathers will fall out." And of course, Icarus, being a young man, did exactly what his father told him not to do, and he went too close to the sun, and he fell, and he plunged down to his death in the sea. According to Bruegel, when Icarus fell, it was spring. The farmer was plowing his field. The whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling with itself. There's the picture again. Sweating in the sun that melted the wings' wax. Unsignificantly off the coast, there was a splash, quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. So he focuses on the important thing in this painting is quite unnoticed, and it's off the coast, and it's Icarus drowning. I cited to you another poem about this painting called Musée de Beaux-Arts by Auden, in which he says, "And the exquisite painted ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling from the sky had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on." They have the same feeling that life goes on even in the midst of tragedy, and tragedy is not foregrounded in this. This is maybe the most wondrous of the poems and of the paintings. This is called Hunters in the Snow. It's about hunters returning from a hunt from left to right. It's about a bonfire over here. It's about an ensign, which I'll show you larger, and you have to see it's still larger. It actually has a detail he'll talk about. There's some birds flying, crows sitting in a tree, people down the hill skating on a lake, and mountains in the background. Oh God, I'm gonna have to, let me see if I can get this. Can you still see it? I haven't messed things up yet. The Hunters in the Snow. The overall picture is winter, icy mountains in the background that return from the hunt. It is toward evening. From the left, sturdy hunters lead in their pack, the ensign hanging from a, I don't know. The light doesn't appear in my thing. So here's the ensign, which he notices, and there's the stag with a crucifix between its horns, because it's an inn which is under the protection of St. Hubert, who hunted on Good Friday when he shouldn't hunt, and saw as a sign from God a crucifix between the antlers of the stag. So there's the sign. Between his antlers, the cold inn yard is deserted, but for a huge bonfire. So you got the bonfire over there that flares, wind-driven, tended by women who cluster about it. To the right, that's this side. To the right, beyond the hill, is a pattern of skaters. Bruegel, the painter, concerned with it all, has chosen a winter-struck bush for his foreground to complete the picture. And the bush is right here. I don't know if you can see it. I have things in mind, but you have it in your thing. And again, he's interested in the actuality of the painting, of the hunters, of the skaters, of the women, of the wind blowing the fire, of the sign that is hanging by only one screw there, what's on the sign. He's interested that in the very foreground is winter-struck bush. I think he sees in this an antecedent of what Stieglitz was doing. And what Williams is doing is noticing what's right in front of him and not what he's supposed to look at, which are the tall skyscrapers of the street scene. This is called Peasant Wedding, and it's the last of the pictures from Bruegel, but I won't end with this. It shows all these people dancing, and there's a sense of immense movement, and these are ordinary people. If you look closely at them, you will see their faces are these are not beautiful people. These are just people having a good time. There's a guy playing a bagpipe, and there are people dancing right there. Disciplined by the artist to go round and round in holiday gear, a riotously gay rabble of peasants and their ample bottom doxies fills the, you'll have to fill it in for me because I don't see it on mine. Featured by the women in their starched white headgear, they prance or go openly towards the wood's edges, round and around in rough shoes and farm breeches, mouths agape. Oya! They kick up their heels. So he has this sense of motion and this going round and round and kicking up their heels that he sees in the painting that he tries to capture in his poem, which is a retelling, an imitation, we might call it, of the painting by Bruegel. Now, this is an extraordinary painting by Bruegel. And the poem is extraordinary also. You'll notice the bridegroom pouring out the wine over here, and the mayor well-dressed over here, and the women who are all chatting, it turns out, and the sheaves of wheat, and the bride, highlighted by the tapestry behind her, and she's not talking. And you'll notice the dog under the table, and you'll notice that they're carrying the dishes in on an old wooden door, clabber and whatnot. Clabber is kind of yogurt, and whatnot is who knows what. So he's going to, and there are the bagpipers, and you're going to see all of those in this short poem, and people drinking up like drinking is going out of style. Pour the wine, bridegroom, where before you the bride is enthroned, her hair loose at her temples. A head of ripe wheat is on the wall beside her. The guests seated at long tables. The bag papers are ready. There is a hound under the table. And you see all that, right? We got the dog and the wheat, and we haven't got to there yet. The woman and the women talking, and there's the bridegroom pouring. There's this wonderful kid kind of saying, ooh, I got one of those dishes. I'm going to suck out what's in it. The table, the bearded mayor is present. Women in their starched headgear are gabbing. All but the bride, hands folded in her lap, is awkwardly silent. Simple dishes are being served, clabber and whatnot, from a trestle made of an unhinged door by two helpers, one in a coat, in the red coat, a spoon in his hatband. I love that. He notices the spoon in the hatband. Not only the red coat, not only the clabber and whatnot, but even that there's a spoon. So just as Bruegel, the painter, has found all these details of the life of ordinary people to focus on, unpoetic life. This is not the life of princes. This is not the life of donors of paintings, as the Italians did. This is not the life of Jesus and Mary. This is life of ordinary people at a peasant wedding. It reaffirms the choices he's made through a whole lifetime. This is the final one. This is called The Corn Harvest. You see people eating lunch. This guy is sleeping. He's going to be the center of the poem. And here's somebody coming through the field carrying stuff for the lunch. Here's somebody reaping, other people reaping. There's a path through the corn. They've harvested this corn. This corn has been set up in stooks to dry. Summer. And notice his interest in organization. The painting is organized about a young reaper enjoying his noonday rest, completely relaxed from his morning labors, sprawled. See, there he is, sprawled and unbuttoned. It's all centered on that, he says. The women have brought him his lunch, perhaps a spot of wine. They gather gossiping under a tree. who shade carelessly, he does not share the resting center of their workaday world. He's the resting center of all these people who are eating, tying up sheaves, carrying food for the lunch, harvesting grain, and yet he sleeps unbuttoned there as a resting center of their everyday world, the working world. That attentiveness to detail, and we're not talking about American detail here, although it would come to me with Williams, and that attentiveness to the lives of ordinary people as they lived their lives. These are people just harvesting in harvest season, and one of them is asleep, and he's right in the middle of the painting. They fit in with Williams' aesthetic of what the artist should be dealing with. Now, here is, I said I would, and I'll end with this, it's very short. He wrote, near the end of his life, he'd had this stroke, and he married a woman named Florence, Flossie, he called her. He probably was in love with her older sister and married her on the rebound. He was, it's a hard admission to make because I admire Williams, and it's not my way, but he was not always faithful to his wife. And so, having faced death, he says, what really matters is you and my marriage with you. And that's what the poem is. It's just a stunning, stunning poem. My students had troubles with the fact that he was not always faithful. I don't have those troubles. I think the ennoblement of love and of the imagination which conceive of love is just, to me, it's just the greatest of all poems. And near the end of book 1, he says this, and it's since become quite famous. When I first encountered it, it wasn't famous. But I think he says something, it's become quite famous since it's, in some sense, so obviously true. And the truth is that we learn things from poems that we don't learn from newspapers or movies. We learn the truths of the lives we live and of the human heart as we carry it through our daily lives. Asphodel is the title of this poem, Asphodel, that greeny flower. It's a small white flower. And so he takes that as an emblem for his wife. Of asphodel, that greeny flower, I come, my sweet, to sing to you. My heart rouses thinking to bring you news of something that concerns you and concerns many men. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Hear me out, for I too am concerned, and every man who wants to die at peace in his bed beside. Look at what passes for the new, he says. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. What I get from Williams, and we'll turn to questions now, what I get from Williams is this sense that this America that we inhabit together is a remarkable place, and it has remarkable people in it. And if we will look at it closely and not be turned off by saying this person is old, this person is poor, this person is not shown in the newspapers, we can see remarkable things. And our minds can flourish and can find peace in the lives we live. It's a great lesson. I don't know that I've ever learned it entirely from Williams, but that's what I have to say. So let's go from that to questions or comments you may have about Williams. I've left 15 minutes for